The trap line stretched 17 miles across ice that had been stable for 3 weeks. Each trap was placed in order, anchored to pressure ridges, and marked with cairns made from ice chunks and stones. The hunters came back on the 4th day after a light snowfall, expecting to find Arctic fox or marten, possibly a wolverine if the season was changing. What they found instead were traps that had been triggered without catching anything. That alone would not have been unusual. Animals escape. Bait gets stolen. But these traps had been reset afterward. Not correctly, but reset. The jaws were closed again. The trigger plates repositioned. The bait removed entirely or replaced with stones. In 3 cases, the traps had been moved several feet from their original positions and stuck upright in the snow like markers. The hunters stood over the line in silence. They checked each trap carefully, looking for scratches, tooth marks, blood, any sign of what had interfered. There was nothing. No fur caught in the metal. No prints clear enough to identify. The snow around the traps showed disturbance, but it was shallow and broad, not the kind left by paws or boots. It looked more like something had been dragged across the surface, smoothing it. One of the men knelt beside a trap that had been flipped upside down and pressed into the ice. He touched the metal. It was cold, but not frozen into place. Someone or something had handled it recently. He looked up at the others and said what they were all thinking. This was not an animal. This was not weather. This was not an accident. They checked the rest of the line. 11 traps total. 9 had been tampered with. The 2 that remained untouched were the ones farthest from camp, set on thin ice near open water. The others, the ones placed on solid ground along the route the hunters used most often, had all been interfered with. Every one of them. The men returned to camp and discussed whether to reset the line or abandon it. None of them believed the tampering was random. Tools did not move themselves. Traps did not reset without hands. But they also could not explain who would be out here in this cold doing this. There were no other trappers in the area. The nearest settlement was over 60 miles south. No travelers had passed through in weeks. They decided to set the line again. This time they marked the positions carefully, scratched coordinates into the ice with a blade, noted the angle and depth of each anchor. If something moved the traps again, they would know exactly how far and in what direction. They worked quickly and returned to camp before dark that night. No one spoke much. They ate cold rations and stayed close to the fire. One man suggested it could be another trapping party trying to intimidate them off the territory. Another said it could be someone lost or confused scavenging for tools. But the third man, the eldest, shook his head. He said, "People do not reset traps. People steal them. People break them. They do not put them back." The next morning, they returned to the line before first light. The traps had been moved again. These were not recreational hunters. They were professionals working a contracted route through the interior ice fields of the Arctic archipelago, hired to harvest pelts during the narrow window when the ice was stable and the animals were active. Each man had worked this kind of territory for years. They understood cold. They understood isolation. They understood how quickly circumstances could shift from manageable to fatal. Their equipment was minimal but precise. Steel traps, skinning knives, fire kits, sleds modified for ice travel. Everything had backup. 2 fire strikers. 3 days of emergency rations kept separate from the main supply. Rope tested and retested. Maps drawn from memory and cross-referenced with landmarks that only appeared under certain light. Survival in that environment was not about strength or endurance. It was about timing, preparation, and the ability to recognize when something was wrong before it became irreversible. Trap lines were the foundation of their work. Each line was a circuit that could be walked in a day with traps spaced to maximize coverage without wasting travel time. Setting a trap was not casual labor. The ground had to be stable. The bait had to be secured against wind and scavengers. The trigger tension had to be calibrated so it would fire on contact but not freeze in place overnight. A poorly set trap caught nothing. A moved trap broke the rhythm of the entire line. The trappers knew the risks that came with the territory. Polar bears could destroy a camp if they smelled food. Ice could fracture without warning under temperature shifts. Storms could erase trails in minutes. leaving you walking in circles until your fuel ran out. These were environmental problems, predictable, manageable with the right precautions. But tampering was different. Tampering meant intent. It meant someone or something was watching the line, learning the routine, and choosing to interfere. That was not a problem you could solve with better equipment or careful timing. That was a problem that required deciding whether to continue or retreat. The men voted to stay. They still had 2 weeks left on their contracted period, and the pelts they had already taken would barely cover their expenses. Leaving early meant losing the season. They agreed to move their camp closer to the trap line, to rotate watches during the night, and to carry their weapons at all times. One man suggested they set false traps, decoys that would show interference without losing real equipment. Another proposed checking the line twice a day instead of once. They implemented both. For 3 days, the tampering stopped. The traps remained where they had been set. No bait was stolen. No metal was moved. The hunters began to relax. They spoke less about what had happened and more about where they would spend their earnings once they returned south. They made jokes about scaring off whatever animal had been curious enough to investigate the traps. On the 4th morning, they discovered that the ice itself had changed. The route they used to access the western section of the trap line crossed a flat pan of ice that had been stable for weeks. It was thick, clear ice, the kind that forms slowly under calm conditions and supports weight without flexing. They had walked it a dozen times without concern, but on the morning of the 4th day, the surface had changed. Pressure ridges had formed overnight along the edges of the pan. Not large ones, but distinct sharp ridges that had not been there the day before. The ice itself had not cracked. There was no sign of a freeze-thaw cycle. The temperature had been steady, yet the surface was different, rougher, uneven in places that had been smooth. One of the hunters knelt and examined the new ridges. They were not random. They followed a pattern, curving inward from both sides of the pan, narrowing the clear path down the center. It looked almost like a funnel. He stood and looked ahead. The ridges continued for at least 100 yards, directing movement toward a section of ice that looked darker than the rest. They tested the darker ice carefully. It was thinner, not dangerously thin, but noticeably less stable than the surrounding area. Someone walking quickly or pulling a loaded sled might not notice until they were already on it. The hunters marked the spot with stones and took a longer route around. That night they heard sounds. Not animal sounds, not wind. It was a low, rhythmic cracking like ice settling under pressure, but it came from multiple directions and did not stop. They stepped outside and listened. The sound seemed to be moving, circling the camp at a distance. One man took a torch and walked toward it. The cracking stopped immediately. When he returned, it resumed. The next day, they found that a snowbank had been built across their primary sled route. It was not a drift. Drifts form gradually and have a slope. This was a wall 4 feet high, packed solid, blocking the path they had used every day for 2 weeks. They dug through it, but the effort took over an hour. By the time they reached the trap line, half the day was gone. 2 days later, they discovered that a section of shore ice they used to access fresh water had been cut, not broken, cut. The edges were clean and vertical, as if someone had sawed through it with a blade. The gap was too wide to step across and too deep to see the bottom. They had to melt snow for water instead, which took longer and used more fuel. The hunters began to notice that the changes were not random. Each one forced them to alter their routine. Longer routes, slower travel, more time exposed to cold, more energy spent on tasks that had been simple the week before. The environment was being adjusted around them, not destroyed but made gradually more difficult. One evening, they returned to camp and found that their firewood had been moved. It was still there, not stolen, but relocated 30 feet from where they had stacked it, placed in a neat pile on the opposite side of their tent. No tracks, no disturbance in the snow except where the wood had been set down. They stopped discussing what was happening in terms of animals or weather. Those explanations no longer fit. This was something else, something that understood their patterns and knew how to disrupt them without direct confrontation, something that used tools or at least manipulated objects with precision. The eldest hunter, the one who had said people do not reset traps, spoke again. He said there was a name for this, not a common name. Not one you use lightly, but there was a name, and if they were going to continue, they needed to say it. He called them the Tornit. He said it quietly, as if speaking too loudly might invite attention. The other men did not ask him to repeat it. They knew the name. Everyone who worked the northern ice fields knew it, whether they believed in it or not. The Tornit were not folklore in the sense of spirits or monsters from old stories. They were a functional category, a term used to describe encounters that could not be explained by known wildlife or human activity. The descriptions were consistent across decades and across different trapping companies. Tall figures broader than men seen at distance on the ice. Tools going missing and reappearing damaged. Structures altered overnight without explanation. Ice routes that became impassable for no clear reason. The reports were always restrained. No one claimed to have been attacked. No one described violence or aggression. Instead, the encounters were described in terms of obstruction and interference. Equipment moved, paths blocked, campsites surrounded, but never entered. The Tornit were understood not as predators, but as something else, something territorial, something that made places difficult to inhabit without making them impossible. The eldest hunter said he had heard the name used twice before in his career. Once from a trapper who had abandoned a profitable route after his sleds were repeatedly tampered with. Once from a mapping expedition that reported figures watching them from pressure ridges, but never approaching. In both cases, the people involved left the area and did not return. Not because they were chased away, but because continuing felt wrong, because the environment had stopped cooperating, he said. The Tornit were described as tall, very tall, 8 feet, maybe more depending on who you asked. Human-like in shape, but not in proportion. Broad across the shoulders and chest, long arms, faces that were difficult to make out at distance, either because of fur or shadow, or something else. They moved deliberately, not with the sudden bursts of speed you saw in animals, but with the steady, purposeful motion of something that knew exactly where it was going. What distinguished them most was their intelligence. They used tools. Not simple tools like rocks or sticks, but complex ones, ice saws, levers, anchors, structures that required planning and coordination. They manipulated terrain. They tested boundaries. They seemed to understand human routines and found ways to interrupt them without direct confrontation. The hunters asked if the Tornit were dangerous. The eldest man paused. He said, "That depends on what you mean by dangerous." They did not hunt people. They did not attack camps or kill travelers outright, but they made survival harder. And in the Arctic, anything that made survival harder was a threat. If your route was blocked and you ran out of fuel trying to find another way through, that was as lethal as any predator. If your tools went missing and you could not hunt or build fire, the cold would finish what the Tornit had started. He said the key was recognizing when you were being tested versus when you were being expelled. Testing meant interference. Moved tools, altered ice, sounds at night. Expulsion meant escalation. Traps destroyed, not reset. Routes made impassable, not just difficult. Camp surrounded. If you were being tested, you could still leave on your own terms. If you were being expelled, leaving might not be voluntary. The other two hunters asked what he thought was happening to them. He looked toward the trap line, toward the ridges and the altered ice and the silent expanse beyond. He said he thought they were still being tested, but he also said that could change. The next day, they saw one. It was early afternoon, full light, no wind. They were checking the eastern section of the trap line, the part that ran along a series of pressure ridges overlooking a frozen channel. One of the hunters noticed the ice first. It had been cut again, the same clean vertical cuts they had seen near the water source days before. But this time the cuts formed a pattern, a rectangle roughly 10 feet by 6 feet, removed from the ice sheet and pushed aside. The block sat next to the gap intact, leaning at an angle. They approached carefully. The cut edges were smooth, almost polished. No tool marks, no chipping. It looked like the ice had been separated in a single motion, as if someone had drawn a line, and the material had simply divided along it. A hunter knelt and touched the surface. It was slick, colder than the surrounding ice, and when he pulled his hand away, his glove stuck for a moment before releasing. That was when the second hunter saw the figure. It was standing on a ridge about 60 yards away, facing them, motionless. The hunter did not shout. He did not raise his rifle. He simply stopped moving and stared. The other two followed his gaze. The figure was tall, taller than any man they had seen, taller than seemed possible for something standing upright on ice without sinking or swaying. It was broad across the shoulders and chest, draped in something dark that could have been fur or leather or something else. Its arms hung at its sides, long enough that the hands reached past where the hips should have been. The head was large, rounded, with no clear features visible at that distance. It did not move. It did not gesture. It simply stood there watching them. One of the hunters slowly reached for his rifle. The eldest put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. He said there was no point. If it wanted to approach, it would have already. If it wanted to leave, it would leave. Shooting at something you could not identify from 60 yards on unstable ice was a good way to waste ammunition and lose your balance. They watched the figure for several minutes. No one spoke. The air felt heavier, though the temperature had not changed. The light seemed flatter, as if the sun had dimmed. The figure remained motionless. Then, without any sudden movement, it turned, not quickly, not slowly, just a smooth, deliberate rotation, and it began walking along the ridge. Its stride was long. Each step covered more ground than a man's stride should. But it was not running. It was not hurrying. It moved with the same steady, purposeful rhythm they had seen in the way the ice had been altered, the way the traps had been reset. Controlled. It reached the far end of the ridge and descended out of sight. The hunters did not follow. They stood in place for several more minutes, waiting to see if it would reappear. It did not. The youngest hunter asked if they should mark the location. The eldest said no. He said the Tornit already knew where they were. Marking the spot would not add any information they did not already have. What mattered was deciding what to do next. They returned to camp without speaking. That night they reviewed their supplies. They had enough fuel for another 10 days, enough food for 12 if they rationed. The trap line had produced only a modest yield so far, not enough to justify the time they had spent. Staying longer would mean risking more for diminishing returns. But leaving meant admitting they had been pushed out. It meant acknowledging that something else controlled this territory, and they were only here by tolerance. None of them wanted to make that admission. They were professionals. They had worked harsher conditions. They had dealt with wildlife, storms, equipment failures. This was just another problem. Except it was not, and they knew it. They agreed to continue for 3 more days. If the interference escalated, they would leave. If it remained at the current level, they would finish the season. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but allowed them to avoid the immediate decision. The interference escalated. The first tool went missing on the second night. A skinning knife, one of 3 they kept in a leather roll inside the tent. They discovered it was gone when they woke. The roll was still there, still buckled. But when they opened it, one slot was empty. They searched the tent, the sleds, the area around the fire. Nothing. The knife was simply gone. The next morning, they found it planted upright in the ice 20 feet from camp. The blade was buried halfway, standing perfectly vertical. The handle was unmarked. The metal was clean. It had not been thrown. It had been placed. That afternoon, their firewood was moved again. This time, it was not relocated. It was disassembled. Each log had been separated and laid out in a straight line, extending from the camp toward the pressure ridges. 30 pieces of wood, evenly spaced, forming a path. They gathered it back up and stacked it close to the tent, but the message was clear. Their resources were being monitored. Their routines were being influenced. The trap line failed completely. Every trap they checked had been sprung, not reset this time, but disabled. Trigger plates bent, chains snapped. In 2 cases, the traps had been removed entirely and stacked on top of each other, like cargo, waiting to be transported. The hunters stopped resetting them. There was no point. On the 3rd night, they woke to the sound of something moving around the tent, not footsteps. A dragging sound, rhythmic and slow, circling the perimeter. They lay still and listened. One man gripped his rifle. The eldest whispered not to go outside. The sound continued for nearly an hour, then stopped. In the morning, they found a shallow trench carved into the ice around the tent. A perfect circle 6 inches deep, smooth-sided. It had not been there the night before. Their maps were altered, not destroyed, but changed. Someone had redrawn sections of the routes they had marked, adding lines that led toward unstable ice, erasing shortcuts, indicating obstacles that had not existed when the maps were first drawn. The changes were subtle enough that they might not have noticed if they had not been checking constantly. But they were deliberate, intentional, corrective. One hunter suggested they stop using the maps entirely and navigate by landmarks. But the landmarks were changing too. Cairns they had built were found disassembled. Marker stones were moved. In one case, a cairn they had placed on solid ground was found relocated onto thin ice, positioned as if to lure them toward danger. The ice routes they relied on became unreliable. Paths that had been clear the day before were blocked by new ridges or fields of broken ice that had not fractured naturally. Smooth crossings became rough. Safe ice became questionable. They tested every step, moved slowly, second-guessed every decision. Travel time doubled, then tripled. Their fuel consumption increased. They were burning wood faster than expected because they had to take longer routes and spend more time outside in the cold. They rationed heat, let the fire die at night, slept in their furs without warmth. But even rationed, they were going to run out before they could leave. On the 5th night, one of the hunters was separated. Not captured, not dragged away, separated. They had been traveling back to camp in single file when a middleman realized the one behind him was no longer there. They stopped and called out. No response. They retraced their steps, following their own tracks in the snow. The tracks ended at a section of ice that had not been there an hour before. A wall 5 feet high, stretching across the route, built from blocks of ice that fit together seamlessly. It had not been there when they passed through. They circled it, looking for a gap or a way around. There was none. The wall extended in both directions, farther than they could see in the dim light. They shouted for the missing man. Nothing. They fired a rifle shot into the air. Silence. They stood at the base of the wall and tried to decide whether to climb it or go back. The eldest hunter said they needed to return to camp and approach from another direction at first light. The younger man refused. He said they could not leave someone out here overnight. They argued. While they argued, they heard a sound from the other side of the wall. A single heavy impact, like something large striking the ice. Then nothing. They called out again. No answer.